The Indigenous-led Unlearning Conversations Faithify campaign has only 9 days left to raise our final 20%. We are only $781 short of our $4,000 goal. Decolonizing refers to writing back against the ongoing colonialism and colonial mentalities that permeate all institutions and systems of government, according to Eric Ritzky, editor of Decolonization, Indigeneity, Education, and Society. Decolonization demands an Indigenous framework and a centering of Indigenous land, Indigenous sovereignty, and Indigenous ways of thinking, write Eve Tuck and Kei Wang Yang in their essay, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. But how exactly can non-Indigenous folk take steps towards decolonizations? Today, we offer 9 actions anyone can take. Indeed, if decolonization demands an Indigenous framework and a century of Indigenous land, Indigenous sovereignty, and Indigenous ways of thinking, then directly supporting the Indigenous-led Unlearning Conversations co-facilitators in our work of providing an Indigenous framework in which to share important discussions based in Indigenous ways of thinking, and helping us to secure control of our own production to ensure our sovereignty is one decolonizing act you can do today. Number 9, learn whose lands you occupy and learn about them. Please visit our website for resources about land acknowledgements. Decolonization means more than just knowing whose lands you occupy and saying that in a land acknowledgement. Do your research to learn about the nations whose lands you occupy. Find ways to directly support their youth, health, and cultural centers. Learn about real rent and land back programs. If you have the resources or connections, consider other opportunities for you to financially support the nations whose lands you occupy. Number 8, learn the real history from Indigenous people. Read books by Indigenous authors about the histories of their peoples. Attend educational discussions hosted by Indigenous organizations. Subscribe to Indigenous podcasts. Attend and financially support future Indigenous-led Unlearning Conversations. Number 7, end racist mascots. Currently, there are still over 1,000 Indigenous mascots at public and private schools of all levels and professional sport teams. Find groups doing the work and get involved. It is the 21st century. We know better. We need to do better. Number 6, decolonize your own holidays. Certain holidays in America have colonial anti-Indigenous roots. The Wampanoag people have many resources about the events from which the whitewashed version of Turkey Day was created. Consider how you and your relations can reframe your November gatherings to support Indigenous people. Did you know that less than 0.5% of philanthropy dollars are directed toward Native American causes? Make your new tradition raising money for Indigenous nonprofits, such as the American Indian College Fund, the California Heritage Indigenous Research Project, or Indigenous Media Freedom Alliance. Number 5, financially support Indigenous people. Financial stability and wealth is disproportional in this country, with Indigenous Americans being the most adversely affected. Based on the data from the 2018 U.S. Census, Indigenous Americans have the highest poverty rate among all minority groups. The national poverty rate for Indigenous Americans was 25.4%, while the Black American poverty rate was 20.8%. And among Hispanics, the national poverty rate was 17.6%. During the same period, the non-Black Indigenous people of color population had an 8.1 national poverty rate. Wealth is different from income. It is the total value of assets minus debts. An estimate from various sources shows a median of $5,700 for Native American wealth, compared to a median of $65,000 of wealth for the American population as a whole. This data has Native American wealth at about 9% of the national average. Your donation is a minor but impactful step in reallocating resources which you can control. Number 4, share positive representations of Indigenous people. We strive to share our stories to provide counter-narratives to the harmful stereotypes of Indigenous peoples, especially Indigenous women. You can help decolonize these negative and dangerous representations by lifting up and celebrating us and our Indigenous relations. Number 3, celebrate Indigenous people. For far too long, Indigenous peoples have been silenced. Our stories, music, and ceremonies were prohibited and marginalized. We have shared many Indigenous stories told in song and dance in our opening and closing videos. Your financial support would allow us to bring Indigenous authors, musicians, and artists to our Unlearning conversations to celebrate Indigenous creativity and brilliance as a positive decolonial action. Number 2, listen to Indigenous voices. An important part of decolonizing the false colonial narratives about Indigenous people is listening to our histories, our truths about what happened and is still happening to our nations. Your donation to our program allows us to invite Indigenous relations from a wide variety of nations to share their stories. And number 1, donate to Indigenous-led programs such as Unlearning Conversations. Financially supporting Indigenous-run businesses and Indigenous-led educational programs like ours has tremendous impact on decolonizing the capitalist system in which we all must navigate. Being fully funded allows Indigenous-led Unlearning Conversations to have autonomy and control of our content and our conversations without restrictions from non-Indigenous entities. It also allows us to continue being accessible to all by not charging attendees. Indigenous-led Unlearning Conversations asks you, how will you decolonize today?